A couple months ago, I started playing the Resident Evil games for the first time. I was completely blown away by the remakes, not so much 5 or 6, but I heard that starting with the 7th installment, things got back on the right track. I even remember this being the general consensus before I was a fan, that the games started off really good, but as time went on, they became not so good, and then shot back into the spotlight in 2017. So being a fan of this franchise now, I was looking forward to Resident Evil 7. But what I did not expect was the most terrifying, nightmare-inducing, cry like a little baby at Margaruite type of game that I don't really know what I'm saying. Point is, this game is scary. I know I'm a bit late, or I'm very late to this party, but with a lot of new Resident Evil 9 leaks and rumors and stuff like that coming out recently, I wanted to try and take a look back at the games leading up to that, and RE7 was the first one in this sort of trilogy. I don't know if Resident Evil games are considered trilogies or not, especially with all the spin-off games and everything like that, but even though RE8 continues the story set up here, RE7 is still unlike any other Resident Evil game out there. And it's also really unlike anything I've ever played before in general. So in this video, I'm going to be going over RE7 and RE8, giving a few of my thoughts on what I'd like to see in the upcoming Resident Evil 9, whenever that may be. So let's figure out some shadow puzzles, run away from Jack Baker, and chainsaw our way through Resident Evil 7 Biohazard. So just to start off, this is the scariest game in this franchise by a mile. Yes, even scarier than that Verdugo sequence in RE4, and that was terrifying. It's also the goriest game, so is there a correlation between scary and gory? I don't know, but in this game it seems like it is. This game changes things up and makes you go in first person, which kinda threw me off, and it was one of the reasons why it took me so long to play this game, especially because I started playing other third-person survival horror games like Dead Space and Alan Wake 2, but I eventually grew to like it within the context of this story. The story itself is very interesting, and it immediately grips you without that much info. You're a guy, your wife's gone missing, you know where to look for her, go find her. It's a very simple setup, gets you right into the vibe and the atmosphere of the story, and we meet our protagonist and playable character for most of the story, Ethan Winters. I had seen some things about Ethan before playing. I understand not a ton of people like him or connect with him because he's not like other protagonists of the series, but I didn't have a whole ton of issues with Ethan here. He's a voiced protagonist, which I love, and I honestly can't stand when games are first person but the character never talks, but why don't we see his face? I'm not a fan of audience inserts, especially for a voiced and named protagonist. I'd much rather go full on like Geralt of Rivia or Arthur Morgan than be this weird combo of audience and character. I just don't think that ever works out too well. It's actually less of a problem in this game than it is in RE8, but I'll get to that later. This is a much smaller scale story compared to anything since the first Resident Evil game, which makes sense considering this is a soft reboot for the series after less than favorable reviews on RE5 and 6, because it's a smaller scale story and it's really for any new audience member to get a hold of. Figuring out the mystery and what's going on is a lot of fun. If there's a game that has collectible documents and I actually care to read them, then that game is clearly doing something right in my opinion. This game, like most other Resident Evil games, has the perfect mix of puzzles and shooting and horror. The older I get, the more I realize that when you have games where all you do is shoot people and progress to the next area to shoot more people, the more I find it very boring. This game, and Resident Evil in general, is the perfect balance of mystery, horror, puzzle solving, and action. The full story of this game isn't even that complicated. Ethan finds Mia, sees that she's sort of captured by this evil Baker family. Ethan has to go through the house and the grounds to get her back and find a way out, getting help from Zoe, the daughter of the Baker family. But as he continues along, facing different members of the family as he does so, he finds out a bit about how all of this happened. How Mia was on a cargo ship transferring a bioweapon known as Evelyn, who takes the shape of a little girl, because little girls are creepy, and then how all of this ties into the greater universe that we know. The Baker family themselves are horrifying, but you also feel incredibly bad for them by the end of the game. They weren't always this backwoods, murderous, and gross family. They were normal at one point, and this bioweapon turned them into something else, which is terrifying to think that something like this could even be used as a weapon, and tragic to think of what it can do to people as a result. I also really like the designs of the monsters in this game. Resident Evil always does such a great job with the monster designs, and the mold people here are no different. In fact, I think that they're probably one of the scariest, if not the scariest, enemy design in all of Resident Evil. The Chris Redfield reveal is cool. I like that this ties into the story, into the previously established universe, but why does he look like that? His DLC also tied up some loose ends from the story while not feeling like they purposefully left that section out of the main game, if that makes sense. Ethan and Mia's story is complete by the end of this, but Chris comes in just to clean everything up and set up more for the future. The other DLC, The End of Zoe, was also really great and wraps up the Baker storyline in a clean and concise manner. I really like when DLCs do this. They add to the story and answer any remaining questions that the main story of the game had. Moving over to some of the gameplay aspects, I like the way that Ethan and Mia just hold guns. The camera angle makes it seem like these are people who know about guns, but not necessarily have any training with them, and this is a pretty big contrast to the DLC playing as an actual soldier. Small details like this are my absolute favorite, and it's something that the Resident Evil franchise gets right so often. Could they have just had Chris hold the gun like Ethan and Mia? Sure, but they went above and beyond to make sure his character felt different from the others. Playing as a character in camera footage is a really unique experience, especially the birthday puzzle room, making all these mistakes and then doing it a second time, but knowing how to avoid all the traps was so much fun, and it's probably my favorite section of the game. Margaruite is the scariest video game boss of all time. It reminded me a ton of the movie Barbarian, if you guys have seen that, and I was just unlucky enough to be playing this at like 2 a.m., and I swear to God I must have woken up the neighbors from screaming. This game does have a lot of backtracking, just like all of the other Resident Evil games, and if you're not a fan of backtracking, then you probably won't even like these games in general. The backtracking is necessary to solve additional puzzles, discover new areas, and get any supplies that you might have missed the first time around. The combination system in this game is really confusing. I know there's a screen that helps you out with all of this, but when I needed more ammo and I thought I had the ingredients for it, turns out I didn't, and I was still missing something. I thought I'd have it figured out by the end of the game, but I didn't. This might just be a me problem, but I never had this issue with any other Resident Evil game. Once again, I started playing the game on medium difficulty, and after dying every couple of minutes, the game forcibly made me change to easy difficulty. So when I did that, the third act was giving me ammo like it was Call of Duty, but I had fun with that. So if you're a masochist who likes the challenge and anger that comes with it, by all means, do your thing, but I'm going to play the game with enough supplies to go through whichever encounter by whatever means I want to deal with it. This game is still terrifying, but having the ammo to deal with things just helps me sleep better at night. This game really reminded me of the playstyle of Resident Evil 2, which itself was also terrifying. But this was just a completely different beast than zombies around a police station. The mold monsters will forever hold a place in my nightmares. This is not a game that I'd want to replay, and I mean that in the best way possible because I am actually replaying it right now with my girlfriend, but I don't want to. The story is straightforward but captivating, the DLCs are great, the gameplay and puzzles are great, so I'm gonna give this game a cool 9.2 out of 10. So going into Resident Evil Village, a game I had heard a lot more about than I heard about RE7, I didn't really know what to expect. If it was going to be far more horror-oriented, like RE7 and RE2, or if it would revisit some other aspects of the franchise and try to get them right. Right away, I was given a choice. First person or third person, and I absolutely love this. I had no idea that third person would be a choice going into the game, so of course I wanted to click on that one, but I did some research first and it said that the third person option was actually added in after and it was meant to be played in first person. So reluctantly, I clicked on first person since that's how the game was meant to be played, but on my second playthrough I did third person, and it does feel a bit janky, but I love that they gave players the option for both. I think all games should do this, and I can say that, not knowing a single thing about game development or how hard that would be, but I'm ignorant to that whole process, so game companies, offer both more often, okay? It can't be that hard. I loved this whole storybook opening sequence. This animation was incredible and really sticks out from the other Resident Evil games, and I was excited to see just how this intro would obviously somehow tie into the plot of the game. We get a very shocking opening sequence where it seems that Chris has turned evil, killed our wife, and stolen our baby. After that, Ethan basically gets transported to a Narnia from hell. Going from a pretty grounded story about a backwoods Louisiana family that was infected by a bioweapon to a story that's basically set in medieval times with guns, with werewolves running around, is a jump so far that only a series like Resident Evil could pull it off. In this game, we see Ethan traverse this strange village looking for his daughter, and then parts of his daughter, and how he'd have to visit different sections of the map, defeat one of the ruler Miranda's children to get a piece back, and eventually unravel the mystery of the village with the help of Chris, who isn't actually evil, and defeat this great bioweapon once and for all. This is going to sound obvious to fans of the series, but while I said Resident Evil 7 reminded me of Resident Evil 2, this one reminded me of Resident Evil 4, which is a pretty popular opinion considering the variety of memes out there about how Village is basically just an RE4 clone. I wouldn't go that far. Sure, they share a lot of gameplay similarities, and even the setting can be pretty reminiscent of RE4. The structure of the story is similar, but I think they're just different enough where it doesn't feel like a straight up clone. If anything, I feel like this game just helped them do the remake that much better. The level design in this game is probably my favorite out of all the games so far, including the RE4 remake. Once again, it requires a lot of backtracking, maybe even more backtracking than any of the other games to date, but when you finally solve that one puzzle that gives you that key that you were looking for to open that one house you couldn't get into earlier, it makes it all worth it. I especially like the design and layout of the Dimitrescu castle. I was very surprised to see that she wasn't the main villain of the game, because I had seen, let's just say, a lot of stuff about her online, and I just figured she would be a bigger part of the story and game. About halfway through the game, I was fairly certain I knew exactly what was going on, that this whole village was some sort of conjuration from Mia's mind because of the bedtime story, because that story coincides perfectly with the events of the game, so all these werewolves and the more supernatural aspects are really only here because they were brought to life by her imagination. I thought that she's still infected by something and all of this was to stop her, but when Chris tried to kill her, it forced the bioweapon out of her and it made this whole village that coincides with the story. I thought that made complete sense, but it's not at all what happened, and the story in the beginning is just coincidentally exactly the same story as the game. I felt like that was a missed opportunity to tie those together, because this whole village and castle was clearly just a few miles from Ethan's house, but he had no clue it was there, and this village is, I'll say, out of touch with the rest of the world. Despite my disappointment on that end, I liked how this game tied everything back to the beginning, with the Umbrella logo and Miranda being the villain who inspired Spencer. There's a few standout sections of the game for a number of reasons. The giant baby portion might take the cake as the scariest moment in the series. Yes, even above Margaruite, which I didn't think would be able to be topped. Still maybe a toss-up between the two, but at least we had a fighting chance with Margaruite. We don't have anything when it comes to the giant slug baby. The werewolf den is one of the greatest times I've ever had while playing a game. You're mowing down these enemies like you do in all other action games, but this is Resident Evil, so it doesn't happen that often, and there's still that fear factor that you have to watch your back, and it was definitely challenging, but it made you think about all the tools you had at your disposal, and you had to use basically 90% of it. But once you overcame it, you kind of felt like a badass. It was absolutely incredible. Now, let's talk about Ethan Winters. After playing this game, I can completely see all the hate towards Ethan, because Ethan makes some dumbass decisions throughout this game. He's definitely not an audience insert, because I wouldn't do or say any of this, but he's also not a very interesting character because of how he's written in this one. His dialogue is pretty terrible and almost laughable by the time you get towards the end. The twist that he was dead and infected with mold just didn't really come across as a twist to me. This dude is basically made out of Lego parts, and he thinks that's just normal. I kind of thought it was implied that he was half infected because he has regenerative abilities. If it was such a twist, I don't know why they did half of the stuff they did to him to make it seem so obvious. Chris looks much better in this game and more like his Resident Evil 5 counterpart, and I like the dynamic that he has with Ethan. They talk about how he trained or had people train him, so a lot of his action heroics makes more sense in this game than it did in RE7. Chris also has a really great character arc of his own, despite barely being in the game. His section was quite literally a Call of Duty mission. They gave you more ammo than I think Ethan found across the entire game, and I knew as soon as I started playing it that people were probably gonna have a huge problem with this sequence, but honestly, I thought it was kinda cool. The inventory system baffles my mind. It's a total mess. Yes, you can obviously buy more space, but why is there no storage box? Some people might like to have all the guns with you at all times, but it just made your inventory so cluttered, and I liked having to pick and choose which weapons to run at any certain point in the game. When I go to pick a lock, it's like playing Where's Waldo, because you gotta find where the lockpick is in a sea of crap. This wouldn't be so bad if there was an auto sort feature like in Resident Evil 4, but there's not. And I know I could rearrange my inventory, but it'd be nice if the game just did it for me. That might sound like a spoiled thing to say, but no, I paid for this game, so I'm gonna complain when a quality of life feature isn't available. The whole factory sequence with Ethan isn't very strong, and I'd go as far as to say it's the weakest part of the game. I feel like all third acts in Resident Evil games take place in some sort of factory, so it just feels overused and overdone at this point. Third-person cutscenes at the end are super annoying because we don't see Ethan's face. It really takes you out of the moment. It would have been cool if this was eventually how they revealed Ethan's face, but they do everything they can with the placement of the camera to not show him. And it's actually not even his face, it's just his eyes, which is the strangest choice I feel like they could have made. Either show us his face or don't. This weird in-between was just jarring and honestly a little laughable. I will say this is the most cinematic story of all the games. It feels like the end of a trilogy, despite it only being 2 games, which makes me excited for where they're gonna go with Resident Evil 9. But there's also the ending and the Rose DLC. So we know that Chris is gonna either survive the events of the next game, or the events of the next game are going to take place way in the future. This also means the stakes of the next game clearly aren't world-ending, and if they are, then we know the world doesn't end, so what is it going to be about? Or is it going to take place way later and these characters are going to be way older? Does Rose age faster like Eva did? There's a lot of unanswered questions with all this, and it's been years, so I can't imagine all of you who played this when it first came out and had the exact same thoughts, only to still be left hanging. Overall, I did like this game a lot. I think the more cinematic storytelling approach came with its fair share of challenges. Some of them they met head on and tackled them really well, and some of them left a lot to be desired. But I admire the risks that they took with this game because, like I said, only the Resident Evil franchise could jump the shark like this and still come out with favorable reviews. Plus, anybody who knows this channel knows I'm a sucker for stories with werewolves in it, so I thought the Lycan enemies were especially cool. This definitely wasn't as horror-focused as RE7, it wasn't as action-focused as RE4, and definitely not RE5 and 6. It was this kind of combination of everything to try and please everybody, so in some ways it felt like a half-baked RE4 or a half-baked RE2 or 7, but I actually liked the mix that they came up with. I couldn't put this game down, played it in a weekend, and couldn't stop thinking about it when I stopped playing, and that's a good sign for me, so in the end I'm going to give Resident Evil Village an 8.5 out of 10. There's a lot of stuff flying around about RE9 right now, about how it's going to be open world, how it's going to be called Apocalypse, and have all these different kinds of settings. I don't know how true any of that is, but whatever it is, I'm excited to play it. As for some of the things that I'd like to see, because I know that's what you're all wondering, I want to see some more characters return. I think with the success of the remakes and getting a whole new audience to love this franchise, myself included, a lot of people would want to see what Leon and Claire, Jill, Carlos, etc. are all up to. Maybe they aren't playable characters, but seeing them be part of the story would be really great, even if it's just a cameo or even some kind of DLC. That might be thinking way too far ahead, but I'm just spitballing here. I think an open world would be cool, depending on how large the world is and if it could keep that same level of suspense if you're in a wide open area or if you're just fast traveling everywhere. It might break that level of suspense and horror, but Village had this sort of hub world and I thought that worked out well, so if it's like that but on a bigger scale, then I think that would work out well. I'll actually say that I think the ability to choose between first and third person would be really cool if they built this game from the ground up that way, just to please fans all around, and whatever the game is, whoever we're playing as, for the love of God, don't have the third act take place in some sort of factory. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you want to see more Resident Evil videos, let me know that in the comments below, and if you enjoyed the video, be sure to like it and subscribe for more content like this. If you do, then I'll see you in the next one.
Yeah.